Okay, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to today's webinar on commonalities and differences among various games-based approaches. Within this symposium, I would like to thank our presenters before we even begin for joining us today and all of you. We will be having each presenter present their different GBA, and then we are going to have a discussion about it. Throughout this presentation, I might be contacting some of you via the chat box just to ask your name and email address so that I can get your certificates of attendance sent this afternoon. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Naoki Suzuki, who will introduce our presenters. Naoki seems to be having some difficulties.
You're still muted, Alan.
Not sure what's going on.
Microphone is
Yeah.
closed.
Yeah, he's muted.
Whilst we're waiting, if you do have any questions during the presentations, etc., please do put them in the chat box so that the presenters can look at them and answer them as we go along. Naoki's really struggling.
Might be Ellen to the rescue shortly.
I know, I'm thinking this. Going to have to remember who you all are.
Surely you've got a little cheat sheet there.
You'd say that, yeah. Got to try and find it. Who are you again?
Looks like Naoki's on twice, actually, on two different devices. I don't know if that's his problem, but he's trying to connect on the other one.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry there. So I have two devices, and I couldn't use my tablet now. Okay, but so I cannot see the Dr. Griffin today. Ellen,
She's not here yet. I will speak to her now. Leave it with me.
yeah. So please email her. So okay. Good morning and good afternoon, good evening. Thank you very much for attending the symposium. I'm very happy to see you at this symposium. I'm Naoki Suzuki from Tokyo Gakugei University, Japan. But I am in Argentina now. And so it is 9:10 a.m. here. I am a moderator today. So I would like to tell you about this symposium. In 2022, we TGfU SIG have conducted a number of webinars. The TGfU SIG has announced a consensus announcement. It united of coaching and teaching strategies, including TGfU, game sense, and tactical games model as game-based approaches. Although GBAs are common and flexible in that it teaches through games, it relates to heavily on the experience of the practitioners. I believe it is important for us to understand the framework of GBAs in order to help more people understand the GBAs and spread it out around in the world in the near future. Therefore, we would like to present clues for teaching GBA by sharing the various variations of GBAs and identifying the commonalities and the differences among them. For this purpose, I have invited 4 very distinguished researchers, Dr. David Gutierrez, Dr. Steve Mitchell, Dr. Stephen Tan, and Dr. Stephen Shane Peel. Will each present for the next 15 minutes in the order. Due to time constraints, we will not be able to have a Q&A session after each presentation. Please visit the link I will send you in the chat and fill in your questions on the Padlet, which will be taken up in the discussion after the presentations, or you can comment back to each presenter. Please feel free to ask us many questions as you like. Since the symposium will be the short 90 minutes day, so maybe the 80 minutes, I would like to ask each of our presenters to introduce themselves at the time of their presentations. In facilitating this discussion, we have also invited Dr. Linda Griffin, who is a chair of the TGfU SIG. We have asked her to be the design discussant who will simulate the discussion by asking questions to the 4 of us them after you have heard the 4 presentations. So anyway, let's start a presentation. I would like to move on the presentation. David, so our first presenter, are you ready?
Yes, I think so. Okay, so
please, present your
okay.
TGfU. Thank you.
Okay, let me share my screen. Please tell me if you can see it. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, well, I have a difficult duty, and also at the same time, it's very nice to me to present the TGfU model, which is, well, I will try to do my best. Well, my name is David Gutierrez. I'm from Spain, España. I work in the University of Castilla-La Mancha, and I'm working in games teaching during the last 20 years. I would say that I did my PhD in games teaching. And also I have, during my PhD, I was very lucky to be in Kent State University with Judy Oslin and Steve Mitchell, which for me is great. He can be here. From there, I'm developing my research in also sport education and other models, and I became part of the TGfU Special Interest Group the last 10 years, and I was chair of the group, and actually, currently, I am the chair of the International Advisory Board. So, in short, I will try to present TGfU, but let me introduce that for my perspective and opinion, and also is well covered in research. The TGfU wasn't something made from nothing. It's a great advance, but it wasn't really new. It was born from a common and old concern, and it was a convergence of ideas. The main ideas came from the concern that games wasn't very well taught in schools, mainly in schools and secondary schools firstly, and then they became a worry or the idea of spread out to primary schools too. Because from the traditional technical approach, kids really ended with a very bad experience. Not all of them, of course. Most of us have learned sport from a technical approach, but mainly those that are not very skilled. So the experience for most of them, or at least a big percentage, wasn't very good. So they know few. They didn't develop thinking spectators as a good performance. And I think it's very important to know it's not only about how to end it, the kids end the school about the sport, but they experience the affective experience in that is very important, which is something that TGfU fixed in some way. So TGfU is now is a broad approach. It's a much more complex than this, but I will try to address the main contribution at the beginning, because my other partners will focus on different developments, something from TGfU, something new, but I don't want to step in their presentation. So the main contribution of TGfU model was the model itself, the pedagogical principles and categories. I will try to summarize these three contributions to make a framework for the webinar. So the original TGfU model proposes a 6-step model. With the first step was to experience a modified game, some game that the kids can play and understand, experience in a global context. Second step is about how to understand rules and how these rules influence the games, for example, scoring, boundaries, etc. Third step will be tactical awareness, which is about to understand play principles, means what it's about in the game, how to play it, how to experience, how to understand that. And then while playing, increase tactical awareness. In step 4, the teacher makes some questions about what to do, what is the decision, what is in this situation, what decision has to be made. And once you understand that, how to do it, which now is linked to a skill execution. So in this, but it's very important, this order. Firstly is what to do and then how to do it. When the learner is aware of what to do and how to do it, we arrive to a skill execution, or step 5, is to practice skill execution, but all the time taking on account the game context. It's not an isolated skill or technique, which is very difficult then to transfer to the game, but it came from a game situation, a real situation. Now the player, the learner, know how and when to apply it. And the 6th step is when we evaluate or assess the performance in terms of those criteria we made for the lesson, the unit. And then we came back to the game, normally increasing the tactical complexity through using a spiral curriculum. So the original TGfU model contribute to put, in terms of comparison with technical and traditional model, put the learner at the center, which means that it's not only about to analyze the content, the sport, how to be, which is the focus of a technical approach, is we analyze, separating different parts, and think all the time how the content should be taught in order to understand all the movements and so on. But when we put the learner at the center, we're thinking also about the affective domain. So, and we are thinking about intrinsic motivation and equity, which is a very important part of TGfU. Another important contribution is the why is before the how. It's pointless to practice some skills that kids don't know how to apply it. So we want to produce a meaningful knowledge. It's compulsory to know why are we practicing, and then to apply as soon as possible in the real context. And also a very big contribution is that the game is the teaching and learning main context. So because of that, we begin playing the cycle. We begin the cycle of learning, playing, and we end it also playing all the time. So in words of Linda Griffin and Joy Butler, the key aspect of the model lies in the design of well-structured or modified games that require students to make decisions to elevate their understanding of games. Okay, a second contribution of the 3 I said is game classification. Again, game classification wasn't really new, It was firstly proposed by different authors like Ellis or Modern and Griffin, and former authors before. But in TGfU is proposed, we say, is definitely set a very clear and now well-known classification that introduce games into categories that have common tactical elements and employ similar strategies to achieve similar goals. So these categories are target, striking and fielding, net and wall, and territorial or invasion games. For this classification is consider the player roles, the strategies, and different elements to taking on account that we can learn common aspects and can be transferred within this category. So it makes sense to talk and compare different games. And this have a major pedagogical influence in the way we set our curriculum. Also in the way we can transfer to the out of school experience. Okay, pedagogical principle, that's very, very important because it's, in my opinion, it goes beyond the boundaries of TGfU, also beyond the boundaries of games teaching. We can apply this to a very broader pedagogical context. So for this, so there are 4 pedagogical principles in the original proposal of Thorpe, Bunker, and Almond in '84. The first is sampling, is the use of different games samples within the same categories. This, as we said in the categories, they share the tactical problems. And when we choose different games, we are thinking about which games are more representative for learning purposes. Before this idea, this pedagogical principle or framework, it's very easy to get into schools, into our curriculum, only very popular sports that sometimes doesn't reflect the full richness of this category. For example, if we work all the time soccer or football with the foot, it's very difficult then to transfer because firstly, because it's difficult to play, because you really need to master a very difficult skill, like play the ball with the foot. And also sometimes you don't cover all the richness that you can find in invasion games. So the pedagogical purposes for this principle is to increase transfer. We choose the best games and we modify them. Is very it will be easier to transfer to the full category, to experience through categories, to cover this richness, and also save curricular time. As I said, it's very much easier to cover the full categories if we have the main or very well chosen examples instead of cover a lot of different sports. So modification by representation is to simplify the game so the game can be played by the learner. For example, if we reduce in tennis space, racket, and it will be much easier for a kid to play. And this is the same idea of all mini games like basketball and so on. But it's sometimes that doesn't enough to be able to play. So we can design all the games much more simple. For example, here's through and catch games, which is, I guess, or I'm sure Steve Mitchell will talk about the levels they propose in net and wall. So there's the much more easier, I would say wiser way to understand the principle of play of net and wall. So for then the pedagogical purpose is create developmentally appropriate game-like. That's important. Game-like is all the time we have to keep the sense, the play principles. So it's a real context. Scenarios that allow learners to play the game according to their size, age, and ability, so they can actually play. I like this expression, actually play, not just move, not only stay in the game, but play in all its full range. So I really like this image. So it's about this striking and fielding game. Is these kids are discovering that they don't have to play the full version of baseball, so they can play another game, and it's even better, which is something very difficult to convince teachers, but sometimes also students. They have to really experience a good game to consider that could be a good option. So modification by exaggeration is when we modify some rules to focus on the tactical problems or a specific learning aspect. So for example, here in soccer, we're focusing on achieving the goal, or here in handball team, we are achieving the last pass before. So we are breaking the defense, trying to create opportunity to score it. So the pedagogical purpose is to emphasize particular information, making it clear for the student how to achieve a certain action. So sometimes the full game, even if it's modified, is very difficult to, when we try to focus on a specific aspect. If we want to learn that in our lesson, there is a difficulty in that, and also we need to practice a lot of times. So we need to create a context which scoring chances has to produce repeatedly, because we need to experience a lot of time that aspect to create tactical awareness, and also eventually to master that game aspect. The fourth is tactical complexity. It's about teaching progression based on tactical complexity instead of thinking about technical complexity. This is considered within the same game category. Like here in Net and Wall, we can see line game. It's a game proposed by Tim Hopper, which can be separate spaces. Now we can move to a common space, which is an adaptation of a spike ball run nut game and catch and throw. Then we can move, increasing the number of players. And with the same idea, we can move to now increase the, instead of catch and throw, hitting the ball. And which is, this is a proposal from the teachers from Windensheim, like Jeroen Kokouk and Waringa, and which is very nice game to transfer into volleyball with, well, it's very complex, not only technically, but also in tactic, because there are 6 players involved. So also between game categories, target games are much more simple in tactical aspects than net and wall, and the most difficult category is invasion games. So we have to consider these ideas when we build our curriculum. So even if I said that this will be the main contribution of TGfU, and all that information I made, it was built and spread out in the 80s. So it's like 4 years old, which doesn't mean that we are thinking about something very old. It's really in the actuality, but also have been developed in enrichment and supported with research. For example, model, there have been different proposals that one in the tactical game model, and also which is a simplification, but also a development from Kirk and MacPhail when they study and develop a more complex, I would say complex, but also rich model, taking on account the framework of situated perspective. Pedagogical principles have been also another design it and apply and research about them, like modification by adaptation proposed by Tim Hopper, and also categories has been reviewed, revisited, and increased, like with tag games, even to trying to transfer to other kind of sports. So this will be the main aspect of TGfU, which leads to the third stage, which is can be called like wealth of ideas. And in that idea that have been developed in different aspects, there have been like in assessment, how to spread, how to introduce in coaching, because TGfU originally was mainly about school context, but now it's clear that is very well approached also for coaching, different ages, not only for secondary, and that's for all ages because it's just good pedagogy, and also has been research about how to include a more authentic sport experience. In following this idea, and I end with this idea, in the fourth stage, we have covered as collective, using more from moving from TGfU to the idea of a game-based approach, which is, well, we designed it, we developed and published a statement in the TGfU Special Interest Group. With, I think it's very important to acknowledge other approaches as our other presenters will present, and also the general idea to prevent that all these approaches prevent to really focus on the very first idea of TGfU was built, which is thinking about the learner and create thoughtful, creative, intelligent, and skillful players. So that will be my presentation. Thank you very much. I hope it was understood. It was very quickly and very simplify all the regions of the model.
Thank you, David. So very good, a wonderful presentation there. Move on next, Steve's presentation there. So Steve will focus on games tactical approaches.
All right, great. Thank you, David. Thank you very much for setting the stage there. That was very clear and easy to understand. And I think the variations of game-based approaches that, and I think they are slight variations, honestly, but they do really originate with the TGfU model. So having you go first, I think sets the stage very nicely for the presentations of the rest of us. So I'm Steve Mitchell. Great to see everybody this morning. Thank you for attending. I'm very fortunate to have worked with several of you. Certainly worked with David quite a lot. Been over to Australia, worked with Shane. Spent some time in Singapore, and it's been a pleasure every time. Even a little bit of time in Japan as well. So it's been nice to work with people who are working on variations of game-based approaches. So as David did, I will share my screen and try and make sure that I share the correct one. Here it is. All right, so you should see the presentation. David and Naoki, you're on my screen. If I run the presentation, do you see it shifting? Or are you just looking at the slides? I think you're just looking at the slides, aren't you? There. Is it now full screen?
Yes, it's good, Steve.
Okay, great, thank you. I called this Adaptations for the Non-Game Specialist, and it really is something that we try to do in the United States. I came to the United States from the UK in 1989 and started working at Kent State in 1992. And Judy Oslin started at Kent State at the same time as me, and Linda Griffin started a year before Judy and I. So we all came together at Kent State at about the same time with a similar interest. And so that was very beneficial. That was very good for our research agendas and for our interests in game-based approaches. So this work really started in 1992. And are you seeing now the slides progress? You should be looking at the original 6-stage model, yeah?
Yes.
All right, thanks, David. So this is just the original 6-stage model. It's exactly what David presented, but with a blue background. So really, that's the only difference. And what we found is that people that were not games experts found it a little difficult to understand. Especially, they would get they would get stuck on the notion of game appreciation and what that really meant. So we just tried to present a slightly modified version of this, just to simplify it a little bit for people to look at and to make it easier for them to understand. We condensed 6 steps into 3, but it really does include all of the previous pedagogical principles that David talked about, and the 6 steps are really included in the model. And so, you know, as David suggested, the model begins, a games lesson will begin with a games form that is modified and exaggerated to represent the fuller version of the game. And through that game, students would come to understand that the rules that are imposed on the game, the conditions of the game, are driving the tactics of the game, i.e. the what to do, what it is that they have to do in order to be successful. Once we've established that through question and answer, we could bring them to, if necessary, a skill practice portion of a lesson where they develop the skills that will enable them to implement the tactics that they need to use, and then go back to the game in order to see if they're able to put those tactical and technical requirements into the game form. So those pedagogical principles are all there. You know, if we're talking about commonalities and differences, I've always argued there are lots of commonalities among all game-based approaches, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. In terms of differences, it was really primarily one of structure. For our teachers who were non-game specialists, we wanted to have a little bit more structure for them so that they could pre-plan lessons perhaps a little bit more easily. One of the things that has been said about the original TGfU model, I think it was Alan Launder, the late Alan Launder in Australia, who said that one of the problems with TGfU is that it's a bit like a plane that only expert pilots can fly. Now, on the one hand, any plane I'm on, I want the pilot to be an expert. But in this case, we wanted to convey that you don't necessarily have to be a games expert to teach using a game-based approach. If you can put pre-planning into it and add a little structure to it, teachers like some of our students who were perhaps gymnasts or swimmers or track and field athletes without a great games background, they would still be able to use this approach. And that's one of the reasons why we tried to simplify this a little bit from 6 steps down to 3. Although, once again, as I said, all of those pedagogical principles remain. So people have asked me, you know, why did we want to increase structure? One of the reasons was that it's a recognition that the teacher is an architect of task design. This is one of Judy Oslin's favorite expressions. But we can be very intentional in developing game conditions that present problems to solve and with predictable outcomes. And so those outcomes can be planned for and they can be used to guide the lesson. So you can see a little bit more perhaps pre-planning than was perhaps originally intended in the early TGfU approaches. With game conditions presenting problems, it does enable the pre-planning of questions to ask rather than waiting for students to ask questions. In my early days as a teacher in the schools, actually in Loughborough, having been in the Loughborough program, I spent a lot of time developing modified games, putting students in those modified games and waiting for them to ask the questions that I thought the modified games would stimulate. And very often those questions didn't come. So I decided that I needed to start asking the questions. And interestingly, when I did start asking the questions, the light bulbs started to come on in students and I could see the thinking beginning to happen. And so within our approach, we decided that pre-planned questions were possible and that those would stimulate student thinking. And if you know, that student thinking was almost guaranteed because questions are planned, and that enables teachers to make more effective use of class time simply because they can plan the various stages of a lesson. There's a little more. We found that pre-planning was helpful for teachers who are not specialists in particular. They were able to give a lot more thought into the types of modifications they wanted to make to games and the purposes that those modifications would serve. But it also enabled more effective longer-term curriculum planning. And as part of our work, we developed 4 categories of games, and then for individual games as well, we developed tactical frameworks to identify the scope of content for instruction. And then also we developed levels of tactical or game complexity in order to help plan the sequence of content. And if you recall the sequence that David presented to us that began with the throw and catch game and led up to the playing of volleyball, that's a nice example of a game going through different stages, different levels of tactical complexity, starting with a 1v1 throw and catch game, progressing to more complex throw and catch games, progressing to a simpler striking game, where they are striking, it's still a net game, but they are striking the ball with the hand, and then moving on to a more complex game of probably 3-a-side volleyball to start, moving on to 4-a-side, and then perhaps leading eventually to 6-a-side. And so what our teachers have found is that those levels of tactical complexity enable them to think about how they want the game to look at different levels, rather than the individual skills that need to be put into lessons. They can think about the game as a whole at different levels and develop the game as students develop physically and cognitively themselves. The last thing that we wanted there to be a focus on was transfer of understanding between games. And so the game categories that Len Arman proposed in 1986 was something that we thought teachers could use in order to teach a variety of games within their curriculum, but also ensure some transfer of understanding between those games. And so the original intent of those 4 game categories was that teachers could sample games from across those 4 games categories. We suggested instead that they could sample games from within games categories. So, for example, taking badminton and pickleball and volleyball, teachers could teach those games sequentially and emphasize the common tactical elements that run across those games to build students' understanding of the way that games are played. Similarly, teachers could take soccer or football, basketball, ultimate frisbee, and teach those games sequentially. And of course, there are a great deal of common tactical elements across invasion games, and enabling students to learn different invasion games would help them build their understanding of those tactical components, even though the technical requirements, of course, are different. So there were differences, but our contention has always been that the variations of TGfU are more similar than they are different. And long ago, in a presentation, I argued that they're really different paths up the same mountain. And I just want to show you a little cross-national research that I did about 6 years ago now. And if some of you were at the TGfU conference in Cologne in 2016, I did present this research there, so apologies if you've already seen this, but this is some research that I did because I wanted to look at how different approaches were used in different countries. So I spent some time looking at some of my own graduates here in Ohio in the United States. I also then went to Vancouver and looked at some of Joy Butler's graduates in the local schools. And Joy teaches I think, an approach that is closer to the original TGfU than the tactical games model is. And then I went to Australia, and with apologies to Shane, I didn't get to Adelaide this time. I went to Wollongong, where one of my former Kent State colleagues was working, and looked at their approach, which was an approach developed by a guy called Greg Forrest, and he called it the grammar of games. Again, a slight variation on a GBA, but it shared many of the common elements. And I went out into the schools to watch some of these teachers teaching and used these indicators of game-based approaches. These were developed by the late Joy Butler when she wrote a paper that was titled TGfU, Would We Know It If We Saw It? And these were the things that she said, or these were some of the things, the most important things that she said we should look for. And so I took 10 of the observable criteria, and across the top here, this indicates whether 0 to 2 teachers were using them, 3 to 5 teachers were using them, or 6 to 8 teachers. I observed 8 teachers in total. And as you can see, most of those components, so starting with modified games, observing gameplay effectively, emphasizing play, using Q&A, playing games that provide new challenges, working in small groups, teachers asking effective questions, asking learners to suggest the next stages. As you can see, none of the teachers did that. They were all fairly new to teaching. So I found that interesting that they didn't do that. They didn't think to ask learners to suggest next stages, but highlighting good practice from individuals and teams and concluding with competition between evenly matched teams. You can see that in most cases, we have 6 to 8 teachers making use of those criteria. So the 3 approaches that I was looking at, the 3 variations that I was looking at, had much more in common in their implementation than they did things that made them different. I was pleased to see that, because I've always argued, as I said, that the various GBAs have more in common than they do aspects that make them different. So a summary of those findings: nearly all teachers use game-based and question-driven teaching. Constraints-based modifications were used when necessary, particularly due to time. And so one example of that is where teachers might only have a 30-minute lesson. And so, their ability to begin with a game, get questions and answers in, technical practice if necessary, and go back to game is really challenging. So a modification in a case like that might be to run one lesson over 2. So a lesson might start with a game, move to question and answer, move into a skill practice, finish there, and then pick it up next time, begin a lesson with the skill practice, and then go back to a game. So that might be an example of a constraints-based modification. But all teachers emphasize transfer. Small group practice and gameplay was common among all the teachers. And we saw, you heard David mention the sport education model. What we found is that many of our teachers use sport education in combination with TGfU or what other GBA they're using. And those 2 models in particular combine very, very well. So certainly there are variations. Certainly I think there are more commonalities than differences among the various GBAs. And I will leave it to Stephen to talk a little bit about how they implement in Singapore. So many thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Steve Mitchell, for your excellent presentation. We will now move on to Dr. Steve Tan's presentation. He will talk about the games concept approach.
Thank you, Naoki. Can you hear me, everyone?
Yes.
Thank you, everyone, for attending this session and the opportunity for Singapore to present a game-based teaching experience in schools across the national curriculum. I'm Stephen, and I've been with the National Institute of Education, NIE, for over the past 30 years and have been involved extensively in promoting game-based teaching in Singapore since 2000. I've been involved in both the curriculum development at the schools level and also the development of teachers to support game-based. So at this moment, please let me share what we have learned over the past 20 years in Singapore and explain some of the developments that we have done to support game-based teaching in schools. Singapore introduced a games concept approach as part of a national curriculum revision in 2000. The game-based approach is called games concept approach because of the name games concept. I was one of the first few to actually use the name games concept approach, GCA, and somehow it got stuck on, and that name became part of our naming for our game-based approach. As part of the implementation in 2000, it was because of a Thinking School Learning Nation in 1997 to try and promote critical thinking that we adopted a game-based approach, or the GCA approach. The Singapore GCA approach was actually adapted from both Bunker and Thorpe's teaching games for understanding, of which David has presented very succinctly, and also from the tactical games approach by Mitchell, Oslin, and Griffin. In 1999, two of the authors of the tactical games approach was invited by the ministry to present, and therefore we have historical links with both TGfU and the tactical games approach. The first thing we did in developing the GCA was to create a set of concepts, or in the UK, principles of play, that will help us guide the curriculum. This is the latest iteration for the three categories across net barrier, striking and fielding, and territorial. We have gone through many iterations, and we have always relied on the expertise of the various scholars over the last 2 decades in developing the curriculum. This is the most recent version. When Steve and Oslin visited us in 1991, he kind of presented a structure, instructional structure, when he presented Game 1, questioning, skills, context development, and Game 2. Over the years, the colleagues at NIE have actually researched the work, and as a result, the Singapore GCA structure is as follows. We present a situational game, followed by questions, and there is game context development, followed by situational game 2 and closure. For those who are familiar with the tactical games approach, it is actually very similar because we actually adapted it. Now, the difference in Singapore is that we did not use terms like tactical problem, tactical awareness, principles of play, because from our research and our meeting with teachers, those were very difficult concepts. So we kind of adapted this game to call situational game, and we simply call the principles and tactical problem just similarly games concepts. Now let me talk about the challenges that we had. In the first 10 years of implementation, there was a series of studies that we went out to schools and try to understand what are some of the challenges that we have found. In 2012, at the TGfU conference in Loughborough, we presented an extensive description of some of the challenges. If you need to know more, please go to the TGfU Loughborough conference and you can find our presentation there. The first problem we had was schools lack the facilities for maximum student participation. In Singapore schools, we have 40 children in each class, and sometimes there may be more than one classes having physical education. Over the past 20 years, many of the schools, particularly in the primary schools, only have one covered space for physical education, and that's the hall. They do have outside spaces like covered courts and badminton courts and the field. However, as you are aware, Singapore is in the tropics, and with the hot, humid, inclement weather due to the monsoons, it poses some challenge. And because of the hot weather, physical education outdoors cannot be used or cannot be timetabled after 10 a.m. So lack of space and facilities has always been one of the greatest challenges in the implementation of GCA. The second feedback we got from schools was limited teachers' capacity. In the early years, when we implemented at the primary level, not all classes were taught by qualified PE teachers, or what we call QPETs. Over the last decade, this number have drastically increased and is no longer a problem. For those who are qualified and is able to kind of teach or implement the games concept approach, their challenge was how to relate the presentation of the games that reflected the concepts or the practical or the tactical problems and ask related questions. As Steve has mentioned, many of our teachers do not play many of those games, especially at a primary level, and therefore may not even understand some of the tactical problems as such. The third problem has to do with exactly what Steve has mentioned earlier on, that there is insufficient curriculum time to cover the concept to some reasonable depth for understanding, and at the same time to provide adequate skill practices. Therefore, the last decade has been a wonderful time for Singapore in terms of some practical developments. Firstly, the program for rebuilding and improving existing schools prime and the primary school implementation upgrading allows all primary schools in Singapore to be built with an indoor sports hall and also other facilities. All primary schools now have an indoor sports hall, and you're looking at a picture of it that consists of a hall big enough with 4 badminton courts inside. At the same time, we have also built basketball nets that will allow students opportunities to practice shooting. Previously, there were only 2 basketball nets because there's only a single court. With this now, we could have more opportunities to practice shooting, which was a problem to try and do the game of basketball. Similarly, at the basement, we also have a covered court that will allow another PE classes to be held. Therefore, as such, right now, the schools do have enough facilities to be able to conduct the GCA lessons. This is a field, even though it is a smaller field, but because of the modified games, the fields are astroturf, they are not grass, and therefore maintenance is much easier for the school for the territorial invasion games. Another major development has to do with the quality of the PE teachers and what they are teaching in school. Historically, PE teachers used to teach 2 subjects. I was trained in physical education and mathematics, and that's what I did in both primary and secondary school. However, over the past 10 years, schools have the ability to assign teachers to only teach 100% physical education. This helped the teachers to do planning and to be able to organize the games approach questions better because they now have more time to be able to do that. A major development was the revised PE syllabus created to help teachers to link the game situations, the questions to ask, and the skill development. Because many of the teachers don't play the games, they have no idea how to present the tactical problems, and as such have no idea what questions to ask about what to do and how to do it. And they were also not familiar with how the skills could be linked. For those who are interested in the PE syllabus, the link is provided, and everything that's shared here in a simplified form, you can actually get the resources. And as far as I know, the link is still valid. The last practical development that was essential was the introduction of recreational games at the secondary school level. We realized that many students will not be able to play adult version of those games, and it doesn't make sense. And because we don't have standardized modified games, different schools were using different conditions to teach, and as such, we have no consistency of students' ability. Therefore, in this 2016 version, we introduced a set of recreational games to help schools structure all their learning. I'll provide the examples later on about the recreational games. Finally, Since 2010, we have increased the PE curriculum hours because it was a concern for teachers that they lacked hours. In a primary school, it's 2 hours. In the upper primary, we move it up to 5 periods of 30 minutes each. At secondary and post-secondary, it is at 20 hours. So over an academic year, students will receive between 80 to 100 hours of physical education. To help teachers understand skills development and the related concepts, and ultimately to know how they can actually link the games, we adopted Judith Ring's developmental stages in games teaching and learning model and linked the motor skills concepts and skills together with the games related concepts. So now in the syllabus at the lower primary 1 and 2, teachers learn skills to control, students learn skills to control the object. In the upper primaries 3 and 4, they learn combination skills. In primary 5 and 6, where teachers introduce the games approach, they are actually taught the various games concepts related to the 3 structures. And in the secondary school, they play the recreational version games. Teachers had problem trying to present the modified games that reflect representativeness of the game, at the same time exaggerate the game for the students to experience a tactical problem. So in the version of the latest syllabus, we decided to put everything into a single page that allows teachers to see the game context that they can present with a tactical problem, understand what's the offensive and the defensive concepts that needs to be done. More importantly, we also wanted teachers to see what are the learning outcomes to what they should do, and also to see the skills of how to do it. So in one single diagram, everything about the GCA and the content and the progression is being presented. And this is one of the major changes that we made in the latest version of the syllabus. Now, if you look at the syllabus and downloaded it, the situational complexities are presented as such. So we are only showing a 1v1. There are 2v1s and there are 3v2s for, and those are the progression that the teachers will teach. A situational game refers to the context in which a specific number of players from both teams are interacting in offense and in defense. In territorial games, fundamentally, that's the situation. Either you have a 2v1, you have a 2v0, or you have 3v1. So we wanted to present that situation because that's where the students, when they learn to play the games, have to make those decisions and have to decide. The conditions of the games are the rules that govern how the games to be played. For example, in netball, you cannot tackle, and in netball, there's no dribbling, and in netball, there's a time constraint. So we kept those conditions as pertaining to the game. And where players in the offense and defense decide what to do, so we fundamentally took the TGfU model of what to do with decisions and how to do and relate it to the movement skills. This is a sample of the net barrier category situational game. Similarly, we have offense and defense. We have winning the point in the terms of the concepts. We have learning what to do and how to do it. And this is another example of a striking fielding category. The whole set for all 3 games categories are within the syllabus. Finally, for the secondary and the pre-university level, we created a set of recreational games, or some of you might call it modified games, so that each schools can be consistent in establishing the practices so that there can be some consistency in both learning and the outcomes. Recreational games came about with the understanding that if students were to leave school and were to meet up with friends, then these are the games that they could actually find facilities and resources and to be able to play. We have noticed that when we go out to the community clubs, we see children playing 3-on-3 half-court basketball. We never see 5-on-5 basketball. Usually when they play floorball, there are no goalkeeper. When we play football, right, there are also no goalkeeper. So we took those ideas and we developed those secondary version recreational games so that the students have a chance to be able to play those games within physical education. And because the games comes with specific dimensions for the playing area, it matches the facilities that we have. So in the indoor sports hall with 4 badminton courts, we are able to construct 4 soccer games or floorball games for our primary kids. And that is one of the greatest contribution, because teachers have a hard time trying to create practices that are meaningful because the distances that they create or the opportunities that they create are unrealistic because they are not familiar. This is an example of a secondary school syllabus of how we wrote relating the games concept, the learning outcomes, and the skills. We keep it consistently to say on the left, we have keeping possession as a game concept, what to do and how to do it. If teachers need to know exactly what situational games to present to the class, they can refer back to the syllabus, because the situational games presented earlier on, they are consistent for both the primary, the secondary, and the pre-university levels. Finally, for future directions, the ministry introduced the Assessment Resource Guide in 2019 to help QPADs conduct formative assessment for learning. This is one area that we are now trying to see how we can measure the performance aspect in the final outcome of the TGfU model for students to learn. For those who are interested to know more about assessing games performance, Mr. Teng, who is a master teacher at PESTA, made a presentation at the March TGfU webinar, and the URL is here. I will encourage all of you to see what is happening in Singapore with regards to games concept assessment. Finally, as an acknowledgement, 2 of my colleagues, Connie and Eddie, they have been instrumental in helping me develop the games concept approach and the syllabus over the past 20 years. And to everyone attending this webinar, thank you for your support. Thank you, everyone. Naoki?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Stephen Tan. So for your informative presentation, we will now move on to Dr. Champion's presentation. He will talk about play with purpose. Are you ready?
Yes, is that presentation being seen on your screen?
Yes, you can see.
Can see, excellent. I'm speaking from Ghana land today. I pay my respect to the Ghana elders past, present and emerging. This land always was and always will be Ghana land. This land, I acknowledge, was never ceded. Naimani, I hope all of you are good. It's about 10:30 here in Adelaide, so whatever time you join us in, thank you for staying on to listen to this presentation. I'm going to go through my journey to get to a model which I call Play with Purpose that we teach the students at Flinders University. So taking you through that journey, my introduction to a games-based approach was the work of Rick Charlesworth. Rick Charlesworth is arguably Australia's most successful international team sport coach. In 1993 and 1994, he was talking about how he used a games-based approach in his coaching called designer games. I started to play around with the idea of designer games in my own sports coaching. Then in about 1995, 1996, Australia Sports Commission through the Aussie Sport Unit invested in a new model of games teaching, and in particular to introduce games teaching in fundamental movement skills, early sport development, called the Game Sense approach. And that had a lot of similarities with the ideas that Rick Charlesworth had been talking about in the design of games for specific purposes. And I started to take the ideas that I'd been playing around with in my coaching approach in the deliberate design of games for purpose into my physical education teaching. Then in 1997, I came across this book by Griffin, Mitchell and Osland, which helped me understand layers of tactical complexity and enabled me to sequence a game-based approach across my physical education teaching in secondary schools at that time. So laying out those approaches as I understood them, design of games was about the coach deciding on a game form that could package technical, tactical, and fitness training into the one modified or situational game so that those components didn't need to be separate parts of a coaching session. There were a lot of similarities with Charlesworth's description of a designer game with the work of Alan Wade from the late 1960s and Eric Worthington from the early 1970s. The game sense approach talked about combining technical and tactical learning together so that they were understood as complementary features of the game rather than separated features of the game which were somehow put together at the end of a training session. It was the challenge of the coach to decide the type of game, so therefore the purpose of the game as an educational context was really foregrounded. It wasn't stipulated that the game would start a practice session. It was indicated that a game may start a practice session, but the main content of a practice session and the focus of a practice session was the game form, because that's what we were there to learn to do. We were there to play the game. That led to the development of what was called game sense cards, which further developed into a narrative of game sense games, and game sense came to be known by many as a small-sided games approach. The tactical games model added in the understanding of levels of tactical complexity, which Steve talked about earlier. It also added in, for me, a way of assessing a game-based approach in physical education through the game performance assessment instrument. Within that, though, I was always puzzled by the emphasis of the Game Sense research report, which emphasised that the Game Sense approach was game-based, but not game-only. And I had started to be asked to do a lot of professional development work to show people what I was doing in my PE teaching and my sport coaching, because it was often unfamiliar to the more behaviourist sport as techniques approach, which was being used in physical education and sports coaching settings. And people would always go, but when do we practice? There are certain things that players just don't pick up by playing the game. And there's the opportunity that if all they do is play the game, they might learn what Alan Lauder described as a dead-end technique, which could lead to long-term injury by inappropriate movement loads on the body, or techniques that will take them to a level that they can't get past without having to then revert back to being a learner again to learn a new technique. So I struggled with this idea of when does practice occur and for what purpose does practice occur? The other aspect that really intrigued me was I had seen the game sense approach as different from TGfU because the game sense approach to me described a non-linear pedagogy, but many other people were identifying it more simply as a small-sided games approach, game sense games, modified games. That led me to come up with an alternative concept because I saw the TGfU approach as linear. It's steps 1 through to step 6. You follow those steps in order, even though it's represented diagrammatically as a circle, you're still following them in sequence of the order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And it was Tim Hopper that talked about TGfU flipping the physical education teaching mantra from skill to tactic to become tactic to skill. And the tactical games model also, as a modified version of TGfU's 6 steps to 3 steps, still seemed to be linear because it went through steps 1, 2, 3. The game sense approach, not having any steps, really just describing the game is the focus. The game form is the decision of the coach or the teacher to decide based on the purpose, the learning purpose that they want. I struggled to be able to explain to people, when do we insert practice? And the other thing that was missing from the explanation of the game sense approach, which had become the emphasis of the playing for life approach in Australian sport and continues as the emphasis underpinning the playing for life approach of Australian sport, was How do we differentiate from those game sense games which are there to introduce fundamental sports skills to beginners? When they move beyond that fundamental sports skills stage, there was no description in the game sense literature of how the games evolve from those small-sided games into more match simulations, phase play, etc., which particularly in a coaching situation become important as we move through the levels of ability of our players. That led me to come up with the idea of play with purpose and the idea that we needed to foreground the educational intent of that first period of play. Foregrounding the educational intent of that first period of play could be two things. Could be used as a period of play, which is deliberately to foreground what needs to be learned. We are expecting, as Eric Worthington used to say, the skill of the coach is to design a game, knowing the moment in play when it will break down. That's the moment that they're anticipating, they're looking for, and that's when they come in with the learning intervention. So the play could be there to open up the inquiry space about what's needed to learn in order to be able to progress along the continuum of achievement. Alternatively, that first period of play could be there, as Rick Charlesworth described in one of his coaching books. It could be there to consolidate the existing abilities, to prepare the players before they get into the new bit. It's almost like we need to use this period of play to confirm that the players are ready for the extension, ready for the new learning. So this is a period of play where we find data to confirm that the players are actually where we think they should be before we get into the inquiry piece. Once we get into the inquiry piece, the coach might be then deciding with the players in a co-constructed manner. Do they all need to go into a breakout practice? Do some players need to go into a breakout practice? Do some players go back to that first period of play because they're not ready to progress? Are other players ready to progress? So as you can see from the loops in that non-linear diagram, the skill of the coach in that inquiry episode is actually being able to think about the differentiated learning needs of their players and which pathway is best to pursue in order for the players' learning to continue. And there's not one option for that pathway. It really is based on the data that the coach gets from the observation of that first period of play. So coming up with the idea of play with purpose, and I've emphasised that purpose in the first period of play is a sense of deliberate practice. And that's certainly the case with that last period of play as well. Now, in the game sense approach and other game-based models that come from coaching emphasis, they talked about getting into that first period of play after the players do a warm-up. So there's another episode where there may be a practice on fundamental sports skills as players progress from closed to open practice tasks in the warm-up before they get to that period of play. Indeed, in many coaching environments, after that second period of play, it's common, certainly in Australian sport, that the players may break out into situational line practice to work on what we would call the craft of their area of play on the field, or they may break out into craft work based on particular learning improvement plans that are in place for a group of players that have similar learning needs, but we have multiples of these learning pods happening with line coaches at the end. This has led me to lay out the play with purpose approach as a way of developing game sense in physical education in 2007. That was upgraded in 2010. In 2013, I added fundamental movement skills. So there was what we call foundational reception to Year 4 curriculum, and then play with purpose game sense to sport literacy, picks up from Year 5 through to Year 10 curriculum. So now we have a game-based model called Play with Purpose that develops from the curriculum from foundational reception through to Year 10, which is the end of compulsory schooling in Australia. In 2012, I started to write about the Play with Purpose approach specifically for sports coaching, and there's a few of the resources that have been developed there, in addition to doing a resource with Cricket Australia in 2007, and most recently doing a lot of work with Tennis Australia on their Tennis for Schools module. So that's a very brief fly through on where I saw the similarities of game-based approaches that have influenced my physical education and sport teaching, but in particular, the gaps that I felt in working with those models that led me to develop the model which we teach at Flinders University called Play with Purpose. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Shane. So thank you, Dr. Shane Peel, for your excellent presentation. Now I would like to move on to the discussion. However, we have only 10 minutes left. In those presentations.
Steve has his hand up.
Oh, Steve.
Actually, no, I'm just applauding Shane's presentation.
Oh, thank
Oh,
you.
now you're on trouble. There you go.
Okay.
He's
Steve.
trying to make up for the fact he didn't come to Adelaide in his last trip.
That's exactly. Yeah. Went in a hole, stopped digging.
Dr.
Right?
Lina Griffin there. So
Well,
came here. So I would like to ask her to say a few words about what she thought after listening to the presentations of 4 presenters. And then, please ask them so your questions.
so first of all, I just want to say thank you all for presenting. It does show, it's just fitting that we're at the 40th anniversary of the 1982 publication, because it shows in this presentation all the changes over time of the various ways we've built on the original model. And I just applaud us for that and show how we have become a global community. So I appreciate that. Questions, we don't have time for much. So I'm going to say one of the challenges we have in trying to get these approaches in practice is, what suggestions do you have or small steps do you tell students, teachers, pre-service teachers as they move forward in working with this approach? Do you have any suggestions that you give as we're looking at a large audience of probably seeking some suggestions? This is all great, but how do you get it working in practice? And anyone can take that on?
Thank
What
you very
small
much.
steps have you? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so we have only 10 minutes left. So please say something from the presenter there. So who, anyone else who can answer?
Yeah, I'm happy to take a stab at that. I can see that Shane is chomping at the bit to do the same. Quite simply, I have said to our students that the game needs to be the driver of this. And so the importance of your ability to develop games that are cognitively challenging, that present problems, is perhaps the most important skill that you can develop. And it is a skill, as is asking questions. But, clearly for me, I think if we can get our beginning teachers to design games that engage and that set problems, that's the key. Questions will follow from that, because some students will ask questions, but again, teachers can plan those questions. So I think game design is critical for beginning teachers to develop as a skill.
Thanks, Steve. Shane?
Very quickly, exactly what I did as a teacher. You just make the decision to start and you start playing around with it. You don't worry about making mistakes. We ask the kids to play games and not worry about a fear of failure. And I think that's the same with us as teachers. We determine to make a start. And as Steve said, it's a skill. The more we do it, we reflect on it, the better that we'll become. The key thing is to actually determine to make a start.
Anybody else want to add in? How about resistance? So if you start something in a school and other people are like, what are you doing? Why are we doing this? Or the poor student teachers coming in and doing this, and the other teachers are like, what's going on? That's not the way we teach. Any responses to that resistance?
Yeah, the one that my students often get from their mentor teachers is, why would you work that hard? And I come down, I put it back down to their professional credibility. Why wouldn't you work that hard for your students?
David?
Yes, well, I was about to to answer quite the same as Shane. And I mean, it's not easy. It's not easy because you have to work hard, but it's at the end, it's about to be a good teacher and a good professional. And if you care about your students, your players, you have to teach the best way. And to show that, you have to experience yourself. I think it's very difficult if you experience by yourself in a successful game-based approach to teach differently. So we have to socialize that. And I learned from the beginning in Kent State with Steve Mitchell that if you really enjoy your lessons, and sport education can also help with that, as we did in your lessons, Steve, and I do with my lessons. I think it's also a good driver to use. I mean, it's different, but to find ways to have a good experience as a learner is, I think, is the key to be a good teacher.
Thanks, David. Steve.
Yeah, Linda, in the early days, and you'll remember this, you know, the probably the most common question that we used to receive was, how can kids play the game before they've learned the skills and the techniques? And immediately, you know, I would say, can you change the game in order that they can play it with the skill that they already have? And that's a different question. It's a different way of thinking. And again, the game becomes the driver. You know, as an example of this, I remember going in to watch one of our cooperating teachers teach, somebody with many years experience, and he was teaching, it was the beginning of a team handball unit, and he had them dribbling up and down the court, dribbling with team handballs when they just spent 3 weeks in a basketball unit. And so, you know, the notion of transfer across games obviously hadn't occurred to him.
Right.
And so, you know, the idea of first of all, of transfer, taking what you know about one game and apply it to another will enable children to play games, but then the game modification piece, we can change games so that children can play it. You know, one of David's slides showed game progressions beginning with throw and catch. That's something I've used very successfully with second graders. So, you know, I'm down to about age 7 there. And very successful at being able to implement tactical components of that type of netball game when the technical requirements are reduced so that they can play it. One of my biggest frustrations is to see soccer, football, being taught indoors in crowded areas. The ball runs too quickly indoors because the floor is too hard. The areas of play are too small so that children don't have time to receive the ball, let alone make any decisions about what they're going to do with it. And so the notion of game modification, play space modification, equipment modification, so that we can change the game to enable children to play it.
Thanks, Steve. Anybody else want to add? Naoki, do we have time for one more, or are we near our end? This has been terrific.
You can ask one more question.
I can. Oh, goody.
Yes,
okay, so any advice to new practitioners on using GBAs that and the wealth of knowledge that we have here? What are the key aspects when you're getting teachers to use assessment? What kinds of things are you thinking when you're planning your assessment?
All right, I'll have a stab. Be clear about what it is that you want to assess. Be explicit with the students what the focus of the assessment is, so they're not guessing about what they have to do, why they have to do it, and to what degree they need to be successful. And don't focus on too much, otherwise you cognitively disperse what the students are able to focus on and demonstrate with you. So it's better to go narrow and deep and actually get something to stick than it is to go broad and wide.
Thanks, Shane. Anybody else?
Can't add much to that, actually, because that was really
No,
well said.
It's good. It's.
Yeah,
I mean, I agree that. Yep. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, you know, there are assessment tools out there. None of them are perfect, including the one that we developed, Linda. You know, but there are assessment tools that people can use. I would say, look for those, modify them to fit your needs. And as Shane has just suggested, I think that's so key. You know, limit what you're trying to look at, because it has to be observational assessment if we're going to observe performance. You know, it's not something you can test in a paper and pencil test by and large. If we're trying to assess game performance, we have to watch children play. And, it's difficult to take on board too much when you're watching. Engaging students in their own assessment can also be good. I think peer assessment can be an extremely powerful tool, but again, you have to keep that simple for students who are trying to observe their peers.
Anybody else? Thank you, Steve. David.
Yeah, I think it's important also, even if I think it's clear that game modification could be considered like a most powerful tool for implementing and to change the way we teach. I think it's very important that also students, learners, be aware of that they can modify their own games. So they be aware that they don't have to play kind of a game if they don't like it or they are not successful. So they be aware of what kind of playing are they playing, how can they modify that. I have very great experiences with very little kids, 7, 8 years old. They modify the games after their experience different games with me, and I'm talking about my daughters and familiars and friends. But they really modify. They okay, then now we play 2 against 2, and if you can begin with 3-0 or whatever. So you play, you score double. These kind of modifications they use to really enjoy and play a good game. So to be aware in the part of the students about these kind of strategies that we consider important for teachers, I think has to be. I think is that in the line of peer assessment. It's kind of the same thing.
Thank you. One more. I have one more. So any advice to practitioners when they're experiencing behavior issues in using this approach? Because I've always viewed it as a bit of organized chaos, and sometimes teachers have difficulty. All of a sudden, everybody's out doing all these students are out doing all these things, and there might be this fear that I've lost control, because that's one of the things about this approach. You have to let go and let them play. So any suggestions for behavior issues you might find?
I'll have a go. It's important for students to know what the boundaries of behavior are, what acceptable behavior is, and what the consequences will be. Then it's up to the teacher to be consistent with the enforcement of those boundaries of acceptable behaviors. I personally like to use a stepped approach based on something like GLASSER, so that it always comes back to student responsibility, and the onus is on them to improve their behavior. And if they do improve their behavior, they're remediated and they can come back into class. But it's always important that the students understand what the progressive steps are in the behavior management, and that the teacher follows through with consistency. Otherwise, the students quite rightly think, oh, you didn't do it for them, how come you're doing it for me? So consistency, I've always found, is the key to good behavior management. And then the last part of that is relationship, that the students actually know that you're there for their best interests, that the students actually know that you are interested in them succeeding. And if they know that you have that concern, generally you get the best, because most people are good people and they will want to do well for people that want well for them.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Yeah, that's good advice. I mean, solid behavior management, of course, is a foundation, and solid classroom management is a foundation of all teaching, whether it be in the gymnasium or in the classroom, and in all subject areas. With multiple small-sided games going on in a confined space, I've often had teachers say to me, at least when they're first exposed to this type of teaching, how do you observe multiple games at a time? Yeah. And that's all about, well, first of all, take a deep breath. Second of all, think about the position in the gymnasium or on the field or on the court that you're observing from. Make sure that the parameters, the boundaries of play are well defined, and that you have established rules about what happens when a ball goes from one game into another. And I've been very successful in doing this again with second grade students. So it is something that teachers can do in these type of situations. So being good observers, I think, is key, and having appropriate boundaries specified will alleviate a lot of the behavioral problems that you may well see.
Thank you. David.
Thank you so much, Linda. So we don't have time, sorry. One
Okay.
question? Okay. Last
Give-
one. It's
yeah,
okay.
let-
Go ahead.
Go ahead, David.
Okay, well, in my opinion, this, of course, in physical education, we have behavioral issues, but in game-based approaches, is a solution for that kind of behavior. I mean, we know that the kids are playing, they decrease a lot. So a good game again decrease the behavioral problems. So the solution is not a problem, it's not an issue, in my opinion, and my experience.
Well, we couldn't end on a more positive note about games-based approaches. So thanks, David, for that. I'll send it back over to Naoki. Thank you so much for great presentations. Naoki?
Oh, thank you very much. So sorry that we didn't have enough time due to my poor moderation, so facilitation. So everyone, thank you for the excellent presentations and the discussion. Based on today's presentation and the discussion, so we will have a global lesson study. Then, so Mr. Kubo will be developing and the lesson and proposing a new lesson in November. Please join the global lesson study in November. It is very important to design the game, a game modification. We need to learn about how to design a game, and we need to learn how to design a game that will be the success. It is also important design games and teach them to overcome the differences in the learning situation involving the diverse students. You can learn about this in the September. So we have a professional development webinar. Please join us there so you can learn game modification. And also you can learn assessment in game teaching. So yes, thank you very much for joining our symposium. Today's symposium is very special for us. So this is a start for having a good community each other. So please unmute. Please give a big round of applause to the presenters and Linda. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so Ellen, please be a closure of this symposium.
Yes, I think all has been very well said so far. Thank you to our presenters and Linda and Naoki for helping out today. We hope you can join us all in our upcoming webinars. We have approximately 12 more scheduled between now and the end of the year. All our details are on our website, which I've put in the chat box for you to check out. Beyond that, again, thank you for coming, and we look forward for you to continue supporting the 40th anniversary. Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody. Adios.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.